All right, today we're going to dive into a pretty radical way of looking at the Bible, and it's all based on Stephen Hill's work, The Celestial Realm. Now, this isn't your Sunday school lesson. This interpretation sees the heavens less as a paradise and more like a complex political system, and it argues that our struggles down here, they're just echoes of a much bigger, invisible war. So, let's get into it.
So, where do we start? Well, at the very beginning. Genesis 1:1. It's got to be one of the most famous sentences in human history. But what if the translation we all know by heart actually misses some key details? What if that first verse doesn't mean what we've always thought it did?
So here's the translation that the source material puts forward. In a beginning, Elohim created the heavens and the earth. Now, at first glance, it seems almost identical, right? But those tiny changes in just 10 words, they have the power to completely reframe the entire story. Let's just break this down for a second. First, you've got a beginning, not the beginning. That little word suggests our story is just one chapter in a much bigger cosmic history. Second, you have Elohim, which is a plural Hebrew term. And third, heavens, also plural. This implies there are multiple celestial realms, not just one. These three little points are the launchpad for everything else we're going to talk about.
So, this whole idea of plurality, it immediately begs a really provocative question, which is our first big topic. Could there be more than one God?
Well, the source points to scriptures just like this one in Deuteronomy, where the Father is literally called the God of gods. The argument here is that this isn't just some poetic, fancy title. It's a literal description of a hierarchy, a system where the Supreme Creator presides over other powerful beings who also hold the title of God. And here's the absolute key to understanding this. According to the source, the word God, or El in the original Hebrew, isn't a name, it's a title. It means something like subjector or placer. It's basically a job description. And that opens the door for lots of beings to hold that title, from powerful celestial figures all the way to Satan, who the Bible itself calls the God of this world.
Okay, so if you have a God of gods and a whole system of lesser gods, what does their world even look like? And that brings us to our next big idea, the politics of heaven.
The picture painted here is that heaven isn't the simple, peaceful utopia of clouds and harps we might imagine. Nope. Instead, it's a highly organized political structure, a government, with clear ranks, chains of command, and specific responsibilities. A lot like a modern military or government right here on Earth.
To make this easier to wrap our heads around, the source lays out this celestial hierarchy with some earthly equivalents. So you've got thrones at the very top, like kings or presidents. Just below them, dominions, who are kind of like cabinet officials or the joint chiefs of staff. Then you have sovereignties, which are like your generals and admirals. And finally, the authorities, who are the officers and soldiers carrying out the orders.
So a celestial government exists. So what? What does that actually mean for us living our lives down here on Earth? Well, that leads us right into this idea of wrestling with unseen forces.
And this verse right here is basically the cornerstone of this entire worldview. Paul writes in Ephesians that our real fight, it isn't with other people. It's not with blood and flesh. It's with the very ranks of that celestial government we just looked at, the sovereignties and the authorities. The argument is that our conflicts on earth are just shadows of this massive, invisible political war.
This really makes the practical side of it crystal clear. You know, we think our enemy is that other person, or that political party we can't stand, or maybe just a flawed leader. But from this perspective, they're just the puppets on the stage. The real enemies, the source claims, are the unseen celestial forces, the sovereignties, the authorities, who are pulling the strings from behind the curtain.
This massive cosmic conflict is the backdrop for what the source material calls the ultimate triumph, and it's a completely different way of looking at the most central event in all of Christianity.
So why was Christ crucified? I mean, the answer we all know is to save humanity from sin. But this perspective asks a really challenging question. What if that was only part of the reason? What if the crucifixion was also a brilliant strategic move in the celestial war? A public declaration of a cosmic, political, and military victory over all those opposing powers.
Now, to really get this next part, you need a quick history lesson. In ancient Rome, a triumphus wasn't just, a good feeling. It was a massive public parade. A victorious general would literally march his captured enemies through the streets of Rome to publicly humiliate them and show off his absolute dominance. This idea is crucial. And the author connects that Roman triumph directly to this verse in Colossians. The claim is that the crucifixion was Christ's cosmic triumphus. So while it looked like a moment of total defeat to human eyes, in the unseen celestial realm, it was a victory parade, where the defeated sovereignties and authorities were disarmed and publicly shamed for the entire spiritual world to see.
So if these enemy forces were disarmed and defeated, how are they still causing trouble today? That brings us to our final section: demons, doctrines, and deception.
First things first, we have to totally redefine the word demon. The source says to just throw out the Hollywood image of some monster with red eyes. Instead, it looks at the Greek root word, daimon, and translates it as teach, diminutive, which basically means a little teaching. So in this view, a demon isn't a creature at all. It's a deceptive idea that gets into your mind and, most importantly, belittles God. The source then gives some very specific and, very controversial examples of what it considers these demonic or belittling ideas. It lists several mainstream doctrines, things like eternal torment, the Trinity, even free will, and argues that these ideas, even though they're widely accepted, ultimately distort or diminish the true nature and power of God.
And this all builds to a pretty staggering conclusion about why we're even here. The source argues that our ultimate destiny, our purpose, is to eventually join this celestial government and be elevated to the rank of gods, again using that word as a title, subordinate only to Christ and the Most High God Himself.
So we're going to end with this, which is really the ultimate takeaway. If this is all true, if our main battle isn't against other people, but against deceptive, belittling ideas, how does that completely change the way we approach disagreements, conflicts, and just our daily struggles in general? It's a huge thought to sit with.